Hello, everyone, and welcome to another bonus episode of the Stephen King podcast. And this time I'm with V.S.Holmes, a fantasy and science fiction writer. Is that correct, V?
Yep.
And you're out on the East Coast, and we're here to talk about what your latest project is, find out what you're writing about. So why don't you do a little bit about yourself? This is your life portion of the podcast. So if you just briefly tell everybody where you're doing and what you're situated at.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for having me today, first of all.
You're welcome.
So I am a sci-fi fantasy author, as you said. My day job is as an archaeologist. So I'm constantly digging up people's stories, both day job and night job, but no aliens so far during the day job.
Okay.
Thankfully. And yeah, I focus on adult science fiction fantasy with marginalized characters. I myself am queer and disabled, so I try and write people who look like me and who act like me and that sort of thing. And I like delving into the dark psychological stuff that goes on in people's minds sort of behind the scenes.
Okay.
When people aren't paying attention. Right.
So that's interesting. That's an interesting mix, archaeologists and writing dark science fiction. I was, as soon as you say that, of course, I'm picturing Indiana Jones and stuff like that. So is it that glamorous or that?
Certainly not glamorous. That's not the word I'd use. There's a lot of bug dope, a lot of bug bites, a lot of poison ivy. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely the adventure there, going places where someone hasn't been in hundreds of years or thousands of years, or at least lived there. It's really fun. It's remote. You get to know your coworkers really, really well because you're sharing every meal together. You're usually, staying in hotels. So there's a bit of like the cowboy romance feel to it.
Mm-hmm. So you develop an esprit de corps.
Yeah.
Very cool. And how did your archaeology career come about? Was that in any way fueled by the fiction that you were reading when you were younger?
I think to some extent. My mom, she worked as an editor for Yankee Magazine, and she did a lot of the interviews and sort of the journalism side of things. And whenever I'd bring a friend over, she would just like grill them. So my friends hated coming over. So I think I picked up that curiosity and that, like, what's the story? What happened here? Who are you? From her. That's very much what archaeology is, just with a trowel and a shovel. And in a lot of ways, writing is the same. You're trying to figure out who the heck this character is and where they come from and what their story is and why they care about this thing or what happened to them. So.
Okay. So growing up then, what types of stories were you reading?
Definitely a lot of science fiction and fantasy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of nonfiction too. My grandmother would give me encyclopedias and on like nature and things like that. So a lot of the media I was consuming was either science or the fantastical. And my mom's a very literary person, but she tried really hard to get me into like the classics, and it just wasn't working.
Okay.
I mean, I did read them, but that wasn't my bag.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was always telling stories about his experiences hitchhiking and overseas. I just wanted like excitement and the drama and the adventure, which I couldn't find in the classics at the time. So,
Right. Yeah. I remember when I was growing up, though, it never went anywhere. I was always fascinated by dinosaurs. So I was reading all these books on paleontology and all these, and they had beautifully illustrated diagrams or pictures of what it would look like if there was brontosauruses or T-Rexes and all this stuff. So that was part of the thing that caught my fancy. And then, of course, there was the Jason and the Argonauts movie. If you remember the old Ray Harryhausen stop motion, that kind of stuff really just fueled my imagination when I was younger. So it sounds like you had a somewhat similar experience.
For sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you were reading fantasy. What stories in particular did you like? Was it like Lord of the Rings or?
Yeah, my dad read me The Hobbit when I was really little. Cool. And then, so, like that's sort of the inception of it. But then also Roverandom by Tolkien, which is the story of this little toy dog that I guess his son had lost a toy and he was trying to make him feel better about it. Like any parent, like, oh crap. And so he wrote this story about, well, the toy dog was actually used to be a real dog, and this wizard was tired of hearing him bark, so he turned him into a toy. And the reason the toy left you is because he's gone off to find his real master or whatever. And I really liked that as a child. So
cool. So that's your Adventures of Heidi Bear story?
Yeah. Yeah. I started that, I think I was like 8.
Okay.
And little Heidi went on all sorts of adventures, like to the jungle. And, of course she like tamed a pony. I was like one of the horse girls, and all sorts of things. And I haven't gone back to read through the quality of the writing in a little while, but I do think it'd be fun to revisit those, maybe as like a middle grade endeavor once I switched gears a little bit.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like you were geared towards writing right from a very young age then.
Yeah, I'm an only child. So
Okay.
we live way off in the woods. So I had a few friends here and there, but for the most part, it was just like a childhood of solitude, which was great. When you're alone with your thoughts, I think that's where inspiration and imagination really can root itself.
Mm-hmm.
Way out in the woods with the stream and the marsh and the creatures, that was definitely, I think, where a lot of those ideas started to seed.
Okay. And how did you nurture that talent as you got older? Did you take any courses at school in regards to writing fiction or anything of that nature? Or is this something you've just worked on your own on outside of your other academic endeavors?
For the most part, it's been on the outside. I once I transferred back to Keene State College, where I eventually graduated from, I declared my major in bio, and I was sort of on like the pre-med track, and writing just accompanied me. I was constantly working on something. And I tried to take a few creative writing classes. I thought, maybe this would be interesting to have as like a minor or something. I didn't really click with like the one creative writing instructor that they had. He really liked hearing himself talk, and he really liked hearing his own work read, which can get a little uncomfortable. So, that just wasn't a good fit. And it was also not the format that I was looking for. He was into microfiction and poetry, which I love reading, but that's not how I write.
Right.
So I was just like, all right, well, thanks, but no thanks. And just kept on writing on the side.
Okay. And when did you finally get to the point where you decided you wanted to start writing more seriously or do a longer piece, like a novel?
Well, the book that is now Smoke and Rain started when I was about 12.
Mm-hmm.
And though I was writing it like, oh, someday I'll publish a book, like most 12-year-olds. And I eventually just kept rewriting it.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I got to like college age, I was like, actually, this could be something I could like actually publish now that I understand how the publishing world works and all of its weird ins and outs. And so about like maybe 2008 is when I thought like, I'm going to sit down and I'm actually going to like try and polish this and get it professionally edited and actually not make a career out of it, because most writers do have day jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But that was when I sat down and thought like, okay, professional, let's try this. And I just never stopped. I couldn't let it go after that.
Okay. Your first book was that's the Star Siege novels, or? No,
actually. So I started with fantasy, and then I thought once I started being an archaeologist, I thought, well, maybe that'd be like kind of fun to delve into that a little bit. And I write it totally different. My whole process is completely different when I'm writing sci-fi from fantasy. So my first book was Smoke and Rain, and I'm actually about to finish that series this spring, which is like terrifying and awesome at the same time.
Okay.
And then the Star's Edge novels, there's going to be 6 books there. And the 4th one of those is also coming out next year.
Okay. So you're running a couple of tracks here then. You've got the Reforged series, and you've got the Nel Bentley
yep.
Star Siege series, and plus you had some collections. So have you been alternating between the two, the fantasy and the science fiction series? Is that how that's worked out?
Yeah,
okay.
Pretty much, which is like it's a little chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really organized in like my actual writing process, but then when it comes to like publishing, it's just like chaos everywhere. Why not?
Right.
But it is helpful because those two processes are so different for me, and I'm actually a pretty slow writer as far as indie authors go.
Mm-hmm.
When I get burnt out on on one part of the project or a character or like a certain point, like if I'm revising one. Sometimes it's really nice to be able to fall back and start like, I just want to create something new. And then I can switch gears to the other series and then just sort of bounce between the two.
Okay. So I'm curious because you've dropped a couple of words there, like organized and planned. Are you a plotter or a pantser?
I've always thought of myself as a plotter, but I recently read something where this author, she said that she outlines before she starts writing.
Right.
And I don't do that.
Okay.
When I start a project, like the first book in a series, I just start with a scene and I have no idea where I'm going. But once I have that down, that's when I start outlining. And I have this like 3-stage outline process, which that is very much a plotter. But I do revise my outlines, at different stages of writing and stuff.
Sure. Yeah, they're just like guideposts for you. Do you know the end of the story when you start, or
not when I start?
Not when you start, but
certainly, like I don't write chronologically. Okay. So I'll write whatever scene I feel inspired to write when I'm drafting, and I find that my writing is just better that way. Right. But then when I go back and like do the revision, the awful revision process, right? That's chronological because that way it's like I can remember like, oh yeah, that has happened, and well we can't talk about that because it hasn't happened yet. So let's make sure that everyone is on the same page character-wise. But it is like maybe halfway through the book is when I figure out the ending, like the details of the ending. Right.
And your writing schedule as an archaeologist, and maybe I'm taking the romantic version, but if you're off in the middle of the jungle somewhere, how do you work around that one if you're in the middle of a book or something?
Well, I always have my laptop with me. Okay. And I usually use Google Docs or Scrivener, depending on which computer I'm on. And I try and write. I'll get up at like between 5 and 6 in the morning and I'll write for an hour before work. And then when I come back from work, if I'm not running the project, then I have a bit more time and I can write before dinner and stuff like that. Right. But if I am running the project, then it's like I'm just drowning in maps. But luckily, a lot of my writing process is offline. So most of the time we don't have either internet or sometimes phone signal. Right. So like we were doing this huge project up in Maine, up near north of Katahdin, and there's nothing out there. There's nothing out there, which is kind of nice because there's no distractions. Right. And I've gotten kind of used to that. So when I come back to like city archaeology where we're doing power lines, it's like, oh God, there's humans everywhere. Just leave me alone.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your career choices recreates your environment from your childhood.
Yeah, I like people fine, but in small, moderated doses is my preferred human intake. Right.
Okay, so I'm curious because I'm looking at your series here, and I love the tagline that you have for your Nel Bentley books. No one fights dirtier than an archaeologist.
Yeah, she's my like snarky little evil person, and I love it. So
right. Oh, so she's your inner evil person?
Not evil. She's my inner chaotic neutral, maybe, if we're going with D&D alignment.
She's your inner monologue.
Yeah, she's what I wish I could say without getting fired.
I'm curious about that series specifically because she is an archaeologist. Do you find that you put too much of your career or craft into the story and you pull that back because the average reader might not be as invested in some of the things that you are as an archaeologist, or is that not an issue for you?
It definitely was at first. So spoilers, the first book takes place on Earth, and it's a traditional academic dig, which is actually what people usually think of, like those giant trenches and the trowels and the toothbrushes and all that. And like, talk about boring. I can't write about that for 40,000 words or however long. But I tried to put, whenever something was being discovered or, something semi-interesting or confusing or mysterious or dangerous was happening, I tried to throw in the science there. So it was sort of tempering this excitement. And then my critique partner, she went to one field school dig where a total layperson learns how to use a trowel and a shovel and like what the point of archaeology is. And so she just went for a week with me for fun. And so when she was reading through the book, she was able to she was able to understand enough of the science for her to be like, okay, this is good, but like you don't need the paragraph describing how to use a trowel. All right. And I also tried to work in some anecdotes because there are so many ridiculous archaeology war stories. Right. And I tried to work in some of those because a lot of those have this commentary where you can see, like, if someone's complaining about how this new person used a trowel, that's a good way to show someone how to actually use a trowel, but it's funny and snarky and whatever.
Right.
So it just stays with the tone.
Okay. And with your Nel Bentley books, as you mentioned, you've started on Earth, and I see as the books go further and further along, she's getting out there.
Yeah. We're not in Kansas anymore.
That's right.
Yeah, I got to the end of the second book is my favorite ending that I've ever written so far in a book. And for people who are reading them, I'm sorry for the cliffhangers. I know I don't write very fast. Just like an awful thing to do, like just leave someone there. But yeah, she ends up not so much on Earth anymore, but she's still doing archaeology. And archaeology and sci-fi have this dance that they have been doing for a couple decades, at least, as far as books go.
Right.
And I think it's really fun to explore that.
Okay. So you've got your fourth book in that series, Heretics?
Yeah, Heretics is coming out next summer.
And is that, how many books do you see in this series?
In the series itself, there are going to be six. And that's sort of Nel's arc. And there are 4 other associated novels and or serials that will be in the world, but we'll be focusing on some other characters throughout the timeline.
Okay.
I'm releasing Star Fury, which is an email serial, which will be in text and in audio for my newsletter subscribers. And each season of that will take place between certain books in the Nel Bentley series. So it'll sort of be like, okay, meanwhile on Earth, when she's not there.
Okay. And has this character, this journalist, has she crossed paths with?
Not yet.
Okay.
But in Heretics, they meet for the first time. And then they're the two of them, both Jem and Andy, who are the stars of Star Fury, they'll be sprinkled in throughout the books as some supporting characters.
Okay. Back to the Nel books series. Is she a solo character, or does she have like a team that follows her around at all? Or
she has a team. She has some friends, and her girlfriend Lynn is a recurring character. But as far as points of view, the book is written solely from Nel's point of view. But she does have some buddies that she relies on, or wishes she couldn't rely on.
Okay, because I'm just looking at the arc of her books here. She's getting further and further away from Earth. So are those characters following her? Are they on Earth still? Or like, how does she keep in contact with them?
A little bit of both. She has a very close relationship with her mother.
Okay.
And she has to travel 2 light years away. And she doesn't know that it's 2 years until she gets there. There was a little bit of deception going on as far as which form she was signing. And so she comes to, in the beginning of the third book, she comes to, and she's 2 years from home, and that's how long it takes for messages to get there. And part of the intrigue during that book is something happens. She gets a very cryptic, scary message from a former friend of hers on Earth.
Okay.
That something's been going on. And then she notices that her messages to her mother have been bouncing. So it's sort of this, oh crap, like if there's an emergency, it's already happened 2 years ago, basically.
Right. Is there a overarching inner character conflict for Nel? Is there something driving her? Something in her past? Anger.
She's really, really ticked off, which is that comes from me.
Okay.
That's mine. And I'd like to think I'm a little bit more constructive in my processing of said anger. But she's really upset about a lot of the things that happen in the world, and me too. And she's trying to figure out how to make that useful and use it as fuel, because she's been using her anger as a way to get things done. But now that she's actually having to work with other people and understand other people, and not just sort of have this rigid, there's no such thing as aliens, this is my life's work, stop messing with me.
Right.
And that's something she starts to explore too in the third book. There's mandatory psychological counseling, and she's sort of like, I don't need therapy, leave me alone. And then she starts to realize, like, well, actually maybe I do need a little help here and there. So it's her anger and her grief, and also remembering that there are people and a world worth saving, and why she wants to save them in the first place. So
interesting. So this might be a big assumption on my part, but it almost sounds like you're doing some self-therapy with this series, or am I really pushing it?
A little bit. I have a friend who's a psychologist, and he helps me with some of the more intricate therapeutic sides of that. But also, I think, like I said, she gets to say the things I can't say.
Sure.
And it's also, I think it's easier to try and fix your problems when you can put them in a lens that is easier to see through.
Sure.
So when she's dealing with this backlash and these complex organizations and they're in space, it's like, oh, yay, like maybe I can write a solution. And then when I look at our world and the complex organizations and frustrations that I have with our world,
right,
maybe I can take a page out of her book.
Yeah. So how would you describe the Bentley books as like, do you have a tagline or an elevator pitch that you would just use to describe the series to somebody that's not familiar with it?
Definitely lesbian archaeologists in space is my go-to tagline. I feel like it encapsulates a lot of it, but it's also just trying to figure out, I mean, the line I said about remembering why Earth is worth saving is the underlying deep part beyond the just funny lesbian archaeologist in space line.
Okay.
Definitely trying to find faith in humanity.
Okay. And flipping to your Reforged series, which I believe is the series that is the one that you started with based on something you saw as a teenager in a National Geographic magazine. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was a picture, a photograph of some desert ruins, and I really liked the melodrama of it. So,
okay.
I mean, hey, I was 12.
Right.
So I wrote a scene, and it was awful. I found it recently, and reading that was a special trip.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to explore this woman who was sort of thrown into this world she didn't understand. She was leaving her home behind in the wake of a genocide, and was just curious about it. So I started writing, and the book is very different now. And there's one line that has stayed the same.
Okay.
One. So
the end? No, sorry.
No. Thank God the end changed. No, it's actually towards the beginning, and it's a tattered flag is whipping in the wind, and the line is that it was mocking the quiet, and it's in the ruins, and there's dead bodies everywhere. So that's the one line.
Okay. What's this series about?
I wanted to. It started out just sort of hero's journey-esque thing, but I wanted to explore people who are supposed to save the world. You can tell there's a theme with my work here, but who are just as screwed up and broken themselves. And a lot of times when people in fantasy worlds, especially, there's like the farm boy, and suddenly there's this big adventure, and it's grand and it's wonderful, and he's always wanted to go past his home. And for me, I wanted to write people who were reluctant to leave, or who were forced to leave for whatever reason. And one of the main characters, Alia, she is post-traumatic stress from surviving a genocide and the things that she saw when that happened. And one of the other main characters is a soldier, so he has compartmentalized a lot of the trauma that he's experienced. And I also like exploring faith in fantasy worlds.
Okay.
The idea of gods.
Okay. Like cool. And what kind of gods are we talking about in this fantasy?
There's a pantheon reminiscent of the Greco-Roman gods, where there's the Titans, and then they created the gods who are slightly less powerful, but still more powerful than humans. It's something similar. So two of the main characters are descended from these creatures that created the gods.
Okay.
And there's a interworld battle going on between the gods, and they're trying to overthrow their creators. And then, of course, both sides have human armies, and both sides have a point. And I don't like black and white, good and evil kind of thing. I like everyone's wrong and everyone's right. So. Okay.
And this battle between the gods, if I'm reading this summary of your books right, it sounds like it's moving onto Earth.
Yeah, the world was once whole, and then it was split into separate pieces, sort of to try and stop this world the war from happening. I'm like, okay, sit on separate sides of the room, stop squabbling, and it didn't work. And it has moved to the humans section, so to speak. And sort of like, if I can't poke you from here, I'm going to poke you through your followers.
Right.
And of course, the humans are just, some of them are blindly following their gods or their deities, and others have stopped having faith at all.
Mm-hmm. So given the current political climate the last couple of years, has that influenced your books or changed the arc of them at all? Or
it's harder to write.
Yeah.
I mean, just from like a purely I'm exhausted standpoint.
Right.
But Nel Bentley, actually, especially, that's harder to write because it's a little bit more real.
Mm-hmm.
And also the pitching of Nel Bentley, she's outwardly queer, and so there's been some interesting backlash happening just on like a administrative level, marketing level. But I think it's helped me distill my point a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And especially also like as I'm coming to the middle and end of these two series respectively, it's easier for me to figure out what the heck I was trying to say in the first place.
Right.
And I think that happening at the same time as this political climate just kind of coming to a head has been like awful, but also helpful as far as figuring out my point.
Right. Yeah. I'm, you know, I've talked to a couple of other writers. I had Craig DeLuey on the previous episode, and his latest book's called Our War, and it's basically about civil war in the U.S. because the president won't allow himself to be impeached. And I mean, there's lead time on books. Like he wrote that 2 years ago, basically, and it gets out now. So it's when things are, as a writer, when things are tough in the real world, I wonder how writers approach their writing, and because they're kind of going like, you know, I'm just making this stuff up, but what's going on in the real world is a lot more scarier. And I don't know if does that kind of thought process enter your mind at all? Or is that just me?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's hard too, because like writing for a lot of us, I think started out as a form of escapism.
That's right. Yes.
And like, hence like the fantasy and sci-fi. And then when it gets darker, it's sort of like, well, where's my escape now? Right. And I've had to go at it because it is so dark, and there's like an incredibly sexist kingdom in the Reforged series. And it was sort of like, well, how, like I can't, it's right outside my window. Like, can I just leave it alone for a minute? And then I realized, well, maybe the escapism isn't so much the world itself, but it's the characters solving the problems that you can't.
Right.
Or at least faster or better or with more success. And I think that's become my escapism, because it is so hard. There are certain scenes that I can't touch during certain things. Like there's a lot of Nel's grieving that I wrote while I was grieving for a friend who had died by suicide. And I was writing all like the eviscerating parts of that. Right. But then when I went back, it's like, all right, you can't have 4 pages of depression in your book. Like, yeah, at least not straight. And it's true, I think, for the larger issues too, the non-personal ones. It's like, let's sprinkle some hope in there, but sometimes it's hard to write when you can't find it outside either.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I was just curious.
Yeah.
And as you know, it's for some people, it's something they don't want to talk about as much as others, which I understand. But I have to ask because it's the world that we're in right now. So yeah,
you can't ignore it. There's no such thing.
So I'm looking at Reforged again, and your 4th book is coming out this year still. Is that still the plan?
This spring. I'm halfway done with it right now as of yesterday. Yay.
Yay. What's your word count roughly on each book? Because is this epic fantasy? Like, are we talking 100,000 plus? Or
Yeah. So all the books have clocked in between 95 and 120,000.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure this one's going to be like the chonky one. I mean, I'm wrapping up like 2,000 loose ends. So.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of has to be. But yeah, my rough aim is like 130,000, and then Nel is much shorter. Like Travelers, the first book, is just over the novel length mark, but they're like bite sized, and the writing is faster paced, so that matches the style too.
Sure. And is this Blood and Mercy? Is this the last book in the Reforged series, or is this still got a couple more to go as well?
It's the last book in that series with those specific characters as the protagonists. I do have 2 quartets that will take place on either side in the timeline. And I'll be moving on to the sequel quartet after Blood and Mercy. And it sort of takes place like 50 or so years after the events of Reforged, and delves into like a little bit more industrial technology, sort of flintlock fantasy stuff. There's steam engines and revolvers and things like that. So.
Okay. And this Reforged series take place on Earth, or is this an alternate history or another planet, or? Totally
other world.
Okay.
It's completely fabricated.
Okay. And how do you have like a wiki built up for your world? Like what's is it have a name, the place, the planet, or is it just a country?
It really does. I mean, like, so I know the planet should have a name. Yeah. I have continents and I have kingdoms and things like that.
Right.
And I have a globe that I made out of paper mache.
Oh, wow.
And like a zillion maps. And I do have Wikia or whatever that's much neglected. Actually, I should you've inspired me. I should
Uh-oh.
garden that. But yeah, I do have like a world built up, and every time I tried to think of a name, it just sounded like silly. So for the actual world, so I just say the world of Reforged, and or the Reforged world, and that's my thing.
Okay.
I saved the fancy names for the people.
Do you include maps in your books for this?
Yes. Yeah. So I have the world map in each of the books, and then each book will also have a couple city maps depending on where they take place. So the first one has the capital of one of the kingdoms and this city-state. And then the second one has the capital again. I think they all have the capital because that's like the main one. Just a couple different cities from the main characters' either histories or where they're spending a lot of time.
Right. Okay. So you've got all this books on the go, and how do you get them out to the people? It sounds like you started your own publishing company to do that, or is that just part of it?
That's part of it. It's easier, like from a business perspective, like administrative perspective, to have your own imprint. And I also help out other indie authors as well, sort of on a smaller scale, and that's been where we've been focusing. But for the most part, it's through Ingram if you're into paperbacks, and Amazon as well has paperbacks. Ingram was like a huge deal for me because I wanted my like local bookstore where I grew up to be able to shelve my books. Which was fun. And then like all of the digital retailers were there.
Okay. And how involved are you with that? Is it 50-50 partnership, or does your partner actually do more of the publishing side and you're more the writer?
It's pretty much all me. She and I went in slightly different directions.
Okay.
She's more into helping authors market, and she's done a lot of really cool things and has some awesome education in that department. And I'm more on the reader's side of things. Like I want to get my books into the hands of readers, and as opposed to like author services. So we've extricated ourselves from one another. I mean, we're still best friends. We went to high school together. So we've parted ways in that way.
Okay.
So I'm doing most of the background stuff now.
Okay. And it's interesting how the publishing landscape has changed, like just within the last 5 years. I think
it's incredible.
The stigma about self-publishing or digital publishing versus traditional is pretty well gone. There's a lot of authors that were traditionally published that are doing a mixture of both. So it's been a very liberating time, I think, for writers in general. On the flip side, it's also very hard to get yourself noticed in basically like a sea of books out there now. It's unbelievable how much content is being produced every year.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it changes every other minute, really. But I think just trying to figure out, like, okay, keep your head down, write the books, figure out what your point is, figure out, do you want to do this professionally or is it a hobby? And like both choices are awesome.
Yep.
And because I've always known, like, okay, I'm not probably going to quit my day job because I love my day job.
Right.
That helps relieve a little bit of the like, okay, I need to make rent.
Yeah.
But I think it's also really nice because a lot of the mainstay marketing things have stayed the same. It's just outreach and building a community around your work and around your message if you have one. And that's really what most marketing schemes fall back on, is having that community and having books that you can get behind.
Yes, absolutely. And it's based on talking to other writers and that. It seems to me that there's a push, or it's almost a necessity, is if you're a writer that's starting out and you're going to self-publish, you really have to look at doing series. It's very hard to make a career out of it as a self-published author of standalone novels. I don't know if you had that experience or...
I mean, I haven't, because my projects have always been like so massive in scope. The only time I tried to write a standalone, it was the first Nel Bentley book. And by the time I was like 20,000 words in, I'm like, no, there's going to be 6. So like, that's just, I give up. But I think too, while there is a huge emphasis on series, specifically in the sci-fi and fantasy genres,
right,
I think as long as there's like a cohesive thing going on, I'm thinking of mostly romance. Romances by nature are usually standalones, or at least, the vast majority of them are.
Right. But
usually this series will be like, okay, we saw these two people hook up and get married. Let's see their best friends do the same thing. Right. And I think as long as you have like an appeal that your readers can keep coming back to. That's more important than just having a series or whatnot if you want to write standalones.
Okay. Just as an aside, I understand that you're also a podcaster. What do you podcast?
I do author interviews.
Okay.
And it's sort of funny because it started out as my former business partner's baby, the podcast did, and now it's my baby. Adoption.
Yep.
But it's really fun because like once I got over the initial like, oh my God, I'm talking to a human being part, like because like I can't make phone calls without having a fit. Usually.
Yeah.
But it's helped me get over that. And it's also helped me meet so many amazing people, both in my genre and not.
Yep.
And especially because I'm usually in such a remote location, like physically, it can get a little isolating. And, the majority of my community is online. So it sort of helped me expand that community.
Right. Yep.
And I got to interview one of my favorite authors, which was like really awesome. So.
Yeah. That's been my experience too. I've been interviewed over, I think you're my 15th writer now, and it's been a very eye-opening experience for me, and I've learned a lot. And I'm always curious about how other writers' writing process, and it's been fantastic. Again, like having you come on with you have a very interesting background, and you're not somebody I would meet on a normal day. So it's been a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, I love that. And it's, you can share so many tips or mutual problems, even if you don't have a solution for them. It's nice to know like, oh yeah, you struggled with that thing too. That's,
Yeah.
It's just really a great way to build connections.
Absolutely. So that's pretty well everything I had to ask you. I'm just going to give you an opportunity. If there's anything that hasn't come up that you would like to mention at this point, now's the time to do it.
Well, most recently, we just released a box set called Dark Horizons, which your interviewee, Catherine Hudson, is actually a part of as well.
Okay.
So if people want like a little sampler of some hopeful sci-fi, I mean, it's super dark, but there's hope in there.
Oh, okay.
They can check that out. There's 5 authors in it, and I think at least 3 of them have queer protagonists, which is really cool. So if anyone wants to check that out, that's at books2read.com, Dark Horizons.
Right. Okay. And all your books can be found at the normal places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I don't know if you're on Kobo in Canada.
Yep. I'm on Kobo. I'm on Barnes & Noble. I think I'm working on getting Google Play up and running. That's a little slow. Of course, Amazon. And there's like 6 others that I'm not as familiar with right off the bat. But on my website, I have the universal link. So you can just click on the one link and it'll take you to all the different stores that they're available at.
Right. Well, V, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope you enjoyed your time as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. And if you want to check out V's work, you can find her website, V.S.Holmes, and all her books are there for you to take a look at. And I wish you all the best with your future digs and writing.
Thank you. And good luck with your writing and podcasting.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.